Chapter 2 of The Harbor of Doubt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Harbor of Doubt by Frank Williams. Chapter 2. The Red Peril. 5 minutes of plunging and slipping brought him down to the main road that gleamed a dim gray in the blackness. A quarter of a mile east lay the wharfs, the general store, and some of the best dwellings in Freekirk Head. Ahead of him in the road he could see lanterns bobbing, and the illuminated legs of the men who carried them running. Behind he heard the muffled pound of boots in thick dust, and the hoarse panting of others racing toward the scene of the trouble. The frantic screeching of the steamer's whistle, that was not yet silent, had done its work well. Freekirk Head was up in arms. Instinctively and naturally Code Schofield ran, just as he had run from his father's house since he was 10 years old. His long, easy stride carried him quickly over the ground, and he passed 2 or 3 of those ahead with lanterns. They shouted at him. "Hey, what's the trouble?" panted one. "Know anything about it?" "No, but it might be the wharfs," he replied without stopping. He veered out to the edge of the road so as to avoid any more queries. He looked with suspicion now on all these men. Who of them, he wondered, was not in his heart convicting him of those things Elsa Mallaby had mentioned? His straightforward nature revolted against the hypocrisy in men that bade them treat him as they had done all his life, and yet think of him only as a criminal. Suddenly the dull red that had glowed dimly against the sky burst into rosy bloom. A great tongue of fire leaped up and licked the heavens, while floating down the brisk breeze came the distant mingling of men's shouts. As he passed a white wooden gate he heard a woman on the porch crying, and a child's voice in impatient question. Then for the first time he lost sight of his own distress, and thought of the misery of his whole people. It was August, and the Indians should soon be coming from the mainland to spear porpoises. The dulce pickers on the back of the island reported a good yield from the rocks at low tide, but outside of these few there was wretchedness from Anthony's Nose to Southern Cross. The fish had failed. 100 years and more had the Grand Mignon fishermen gone out with net and hand-line and trawl, and for that length of time the millions in the sea had fed, clothed, and housed the 1,000 on the island. When prices had been good there were even luxuries, and history tells of men who in one haul from a weir have made their $25,000 in an hour. This was all gone now. The fish had failed. Day after day since early spring the men had put to sea in their sloops and motor dories, trawling and hand-lining from 20 miles out in the Atlantic to 4½ fathoms off Dutch Edge. The result was the same. The fish were poor and few. Even at Bulkhead Rip, where the 60-pounders played among the racing tides, there was scarcely a bite. A fisherman lives on luck, so for a month there was no remark upon the suddenly changed condition. But after that, as the days passed and not a full dory raced up to Bill Boughton's fish stand, muttered whispers and old tales went up and down the island. It was recalled that the fish left a certain Norwegian coast once for a period of 50 years, and that the whole occupation of the people of that coast was changed. Was that to be the fate of Grand Mignon? If so, what could they do? Extensive farming on the rocky island was impossible, and not one ship had ever been built there for the trade. Where would things end? So it had gone until now, in the middle of August, the people of Freekirk Head, Seal Cove, and Great Harbor, the main villages along the front or Atlantic side of the island, were face to face with the question of actual life or death. So far the season's catch was barely up to that of a good month in normal times. Credit was low, and salting and drying were almost useless, for the people ate most of their own catch. Things were at a standstill. And now the fire on top of it all! Captain Code Schofield thought of all these things as he ran along the King's Road toward the fire. Now he was almost upon it, and could see that the fish stand and wharf of the two wealthiest men in the village were burning furiously. The roar of the flames came to him. 100 yards back from the water stood Bill Boughton's general store, and next it, in a row, dwellings. Typical white fishermen's cottages with green blinds and a flower-filled dory in the front yard. The King's Road divided at Bill Boughton's store, the branch leading down to the wharfs, while the main road went on to Swallowtail Light. Schofield plunged down the branch into the full glare of the fire, where a crowd of men had already gathered. As good luck would have it, there was not a vessel tied up to the stand, the whole fleet being made fast to its moorings in the bay. Code's first duty when he started running had been to make sure that his Laughing Lass was riding safely at her anchorage. The burning wharfs faced south. The brisk breeze was southeast and bore a promise of possible rain. The steamer Grande Mignon, after giving the first warning, had steamed away from her perilous dockage to a point half a mile nearer the entrance to the bay, and now lay there shrieking until the frowning cliffs and abrupt hills echoed with the hideous noise. "How did it happen?" asked Schofield of the first man he met. "Dunno exactly. Calculate some tanks in the oil room caught first. Can't do much with them wharfs, I guess." "Who's in charge of things here?" "The squire." Schofield hurried away in search of Squire Hardy, head man of the village, and local justice of the peace. He found him working like a Trojan, his white whiskers ruffled into a circle about his face. "Lend us a hand here, Code," yelled the squire, who, with 3 other men, was attempting to get a great circular horse trough under a huge pump with a handle long enough for 3 men to lay hold of. Schofield fell to with a will, and helped move the trough into place. The squire set the 3 men to the task of filling it, and then went to Code. "Any chance to save those wharfs, d'you think?" "No, squire. Better leave them and the fish houses and work on Boughton's store and the cottages. They're right in path of the wind. It'll be tough on Nailor and Thomas to lose their stand and houses, but you know what'll happen if the fire gets into the dwellings." "I thought so all along. Curse me if I didn't," yelled the judge, and then, turning toward a crowd of men who were looking apprehensively here and there, he shouted, "All hands with the buckets now, lively!" Suddenly the basement doors of Boughton's store were thrown open, and a huge, black-bearded man with a great voice appeared there. "Buckets this way!" he bellowed, in a tone that rose clearly above the roar and crackle of the fire. As the men reached him, he handed out the implements from great stacks at his feet: rubber buckets, wooden buckets, tin and iron buckets, new, old, rusty, and galvanized. It was Pete Ellinwood, the fire marshal of the village and custodian of the apparatus. Because in the 100 or more years of its existence there has never been water pressure in Grande Mignon, the fighting of a fire there with primitive means has become an exact and beautiful science. A few bold spirits had disputed the wisdom of Squire Hardy's orders to let the wharf and fish house burn, and had attempted to give them a dousing. In less than 5 minutes they had retreated, singed and hairless, due to a sudden explosion of a drum of oil. "Play on Bill Boughton's store," came the order. Already an iron ladder reached to the eaves of the building. 2 men galloped up its length, dragging behind them another ladder with a pair of huge hooks at the end. Clinging like monkeys, they worked this up over their heads and up the shingles, until the hooks caught squarely across the ridge pole of the house. Then, on hands and feet, they trotted up this and sat astride the ridge pole. One of these was Code Schofield. Other men now swarmed up the ladders, until there was one on every rung from the ground to the top of the house. Below, a line of men extended from the foot of the ladder to the great circular horse trough. Another line extended from the opposite side of the store also to the horse trough, where 3 men worked the great pump. Back 20 yards, along the King's Road, a white-faced row of women and children stood, ready to rush home and move their furniture into the fields. Code, looking down, made out his mother and returned her friendly wave. Their house was across the road not 100 feet away. With a muffled roar another drum on the pier exploded. A great wave of molten fire shot out in the breeze, and the shingles on Bill Boughton's store, parched with the drought of a month, burst into quick flame. The squire ran back to the water trough. "Dip!" he yelled. Big Pete Ellinwood, with the piles of buckets beside him, seized one and twitched it full. "Pass!" screamed the squire as it came up dripping. Ellinwood's great arm swung forward to meet the arm of the man a yard away. The bucket changed hands and went forward without losing a drop. Up it went swiftly from one to another to the eaves, to the 2 men at the top. Now the fire sent branches out from the burning wharf along the low frames where some of the season's miserable catch was drying in the open air after salting. The fish curled and blackened in the fierce heat. Only 2 men were not in the bucket brigade. They were Nailor and Thomas, who stood watching the destruction of their whole property. They knew the squire had done well in saving the village rather than their own buildings. It was the tacit understanding in Freekirk Head that a few should lose rather than the many. Code Schofield, from his perch on the Boughton roof tree, looked down again to where he had last seen his mother. Once more he distinguished the tall figure with its white face looking anxiously up at him, and he waved his hand reassuringly. Then his eye was caught by 2 other figures that lurked in the first shadows farther up the King's Road. A moment later he made sure of their identity. They were Nellie Tanner and Nat Burns. For years there had been a dislike between the Burnses and the Schofields. Old Jasper Schofield, Code's father, and Michael Burns had become enemies over the same girl a quarter of a century before, and the breach had never been healed. Old Captain Jasper had won, but he had never forgotten, and Michael had never forgiven. Quite unconsciously the feud had been passed on to the children of both, for Michael had married within a few years, and from school days Code and Nat had been the leaders of rival gangs. When they became young men they matched their season's catches and raced their father's schooners. They were the 2 natural leaders of the Freekirk Head young bloods, but they were never on the same side of an argument. Schofield wondered why Nat Burns was not at the fire, as usual attempting to make himself leader of the battle without doing much of the work, and now the reason was apparent. He preferred to pursue his courting under the eyes of the village rather than to obey the unwritten law of service. And he was with Nellie Tanner. Unlike most youths, there had never been a time in Code's life when he had passed the favor of his affections around. Since the time they were both 5, Nellie Tanner had supplied in full all the feminine requirements he had ever desired. And she did at this moment. but Nat Burns had seen a great deal of her in the last 3 months, he remembered, taking advantage of Code's desperate search for fish. Once in this train his thoughts bore him on and on. Memories, speculations, and desires crowded his mind, and he forgot that beneath him the roof of Boughton's store was burning more and more briskly. Suddenly the man beside him on the ridgepole shook his arm. "Say, Code," he cried, "what's that burning over there? I didn't know the fire had gone across the street." Schofield looked up quickly and followed the direction of the other's arm, that pointed through the trees to the opposite side of King's Road and a little to westward. "Good Lord!" he cried excitedly. "It's my own place! And my mother is all alone down there! Quick, send somebody up here! I'm going!" Chapter 2. Recording by Roger Moline.